All right. Perfect. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to the organizers for inviting me. To be honest, one of the things I've been thinking about since the beginning of the day is how great it is to have interdisciplinary work, especially for this kind of projects. And I've been discussing with Maggie about the BRI and the whole World Bank team about the BRI for a long time already. And we are mostly focused on the quantifying the economic consequences of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the political aspect is very interesting and very relevant for us as well. And I wish actually I would have been able to attend this kind of forums much earlier in the work of the World Bank on the BRI. So thanks a lot for doing it. A bit too late for me, but but I think it's a terrific initiative, and it shows how much interdisciplinary work is needed in many areas of academia and more broadly on global topics. So this paper or this work is called Common Transport Infrastructure. And really, it's about quantifying the gains that could arise from implementing all the transport projects associated with the Belt and Road Initiative, and quantifying that for all countries in the world. And the whole idea that I'm going to try and sell to you today is the fact that the Belt and Road Initiative is an extremely large change in the network of transport infrastructure all around the world, and it will have impact not only on BRI countries, but on many other countries in the world. And as a result, there will be a mismatch between investments and gains. Because a lot of countries could or might be able to gain because other countries are going to invest into their own transport infrastructure. And on the other hand, some countries that will invest will not gain from those infrastructure. So this misalignment between the gains and the cost of the Belt and Road Initiative transport infrastructure is one of the key ideas we want to push forward. Then the actual numbers that come from the quantification, then we can talk about it, we can do sensibility. But the core idea is really about the systemic impact that we can expect from the Belt and Road Initiative and the misalignment between the cost and the gains. Oh, I forgot to say, and I've been instructed to say, so a disclaimer, so I now work for the Federal Reserve, and none of what I'm going to say and present today represents what the Federal Reserve might think in the future. And this is not that represent the idea and the views of the US government. This is just my work, and if there's mistake or just stupid things, this is my fault. Right, so again, so what is the goal with this paper and this series of papers and this presentation is to quantify the gain in terms of GDP. So mostly GDP and welfare, say for today, of the Belt and Road Initiative. So first, the BRI, and as we've learned this morning and also earlier this afternoon, the BRI is a multifaceted initiative, and it encompasses transport infrastructure projects, but it has various motives, including strategic ones in the long run, security, so many things. Here, we're going to focus on one thing and one thing only, kind of to balance the analysis, which is to say, let's say we have a list, and we'll talk about that, a list of all the transport infrastructure associated with the BRI, all the roads, all the ports, all the rails, and let's see those are implemented. If they are implemented, what would be the gains and what would be the distribution of those gains across countries in terms of GDP and welfare. And the key idea and kind of economic mechanism I would like to discuss throughout this presentation is the fact that because the BRI is about investing into transport, which is systemic in nature, and because the production process in today's world is very systemic, meaning you have input-output linkages across countries, there's going to be a propagation of the gains that are hard to anticipate. And because of the interconnection between decreasing trade costs and input-output linkages, there will be a reallocation of comparative advantage. So now it's going to be a bit more, I'm going to be not too technical, but just a tiny bit more in terms of economic thinking. How much a country is going to be able to gain from the BRI depends on how much its cost of production is going to decrease, but relative to other countries in the world. And so it's not because you experience a reduction in the cost of shipping goods abroad or the cost of sourcing inputs from other countries that you will gain necessarily. It depends on the relative gains all across all sectors and all countries in the world. And we believed when we started this project that that's exactly why if you want to quantify the potential gain from the BRI, you need to have somewhat fairly complicated general equilibrium and big kind of economic machinery. I'm not going to go into the details of this machinery today, but the goal is to take very seriously the distribution of the gains, all the input-output linkages across countries to try and quantify who's going to gain and who's going to lose. In terms of roadmap, as Maggie kind of hinted already, the first step is going to be to try and estimate the gains in transport costs that would result from the Belt and Road Initiative. This alone is going to be a very complicated issue. Then we're going to feed those decreasing trade costs into a structural model of trade across countries and look at the results. And then we're going to analyze the results and look at the mismatch between cost and investment and the sources of the gain. Who gains because of a decrease in input sourcing, decrease in the cost of sourcing input? Who gains because of a better access to foreign markets, and so on and so forth. This is kind of the questions you're going to ask with the result of our work. And this could help countries understanding why they would gain or lose from the BRI, because the potential mechanisms are fairly complicated. So, very quickly, what is the BRI? It's a way for China to connect with the rest of the world. And this is one of the very many maps you can find in many projects. And usually, this is what it is, a map when you have a vague notion of where the new corridor are going to be. What we want to do in this project is to be much more precise. So the quality of this image is not great. But the idea was to start by doing the following thing. Let's try and put together a list of all the BRI projects. So there are actually two guys at the World Bank, not co-author of this paper, but another paper, who spend a lot of time browsing the news and press releases on all those countries, have a list, an exact list of all the BRI projects. Not only that, but they put those projects to a map. So very precisely, what is going to be, you look at the CPEC, or the Chinese-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Exactly, where are all those rails, upgraded rails, where are they going to be? Those new ports, upgraded ports, where are they going to be? And the idea for us is to say, look, we can have a model of the current network of transportation. And so we're going to use this network of transportation links to measure the time it takes to go between any two cities in the world. And from this kind of baseline or ex-ante value, we need to enrich the network of transportation with all those new and upgraded projects to see how enriching the transport network by all those links and all those new ports, how this is going to change the time it takes to go from any city in the world to any other city in the world. So just to be a bit more precise, so you have the world, no? It's a sphere actually, so you have the world. Like a map. And so let's say you put, because you have data on that, you can find that, it's pretty easy actually to find data, 1,000 cities all around the world. And you use the current transport links, all the rails, all the ports, and you use the current transport to compute the time it takes to go from any city to any other cities in the world, right? So that's kind of the shipping time. From that, you enrich the transport network with those projects. Sometimes it's a new project, so you're adding a link to the network, that's great. Sometimes it's an upgrading of a port or a rail, so you increase the speed along this portion, and you use that with a lot of assumptions regarding the time it takes to cross a border, the time it takes to be handled at the port. So there's a lot of assumptions in the background, but you run an ex post scenario, so then you can understand what is the gain in terms of the time it takes to go from any city to other cities in the world. And that would be the gain in terms of shipping time, right? But the gain in terms of shipping time, that doesn't mean the same thing if you're shipping time-sensitive goods, so perishable goods, for which you need to arrive at the destination on a timely manner. Whereas if you're shipping some non-time-sensitive goods, coal or whatnot, that you can store. So to transform those gains in terms of shipping time into gains in terms of trade costs, we're going to use sector-specific value of time. Two extremely smart people, Helmers and Shor. So I'm not going to they do it, but the idea is to say, once you have the decrease in shipment time between any two cities or any two countries, once you aggregate in the world, then how much this translates into gains in terms of trade costs, that depends on exactly what you're producing or what you're importing, right? So now you're starting to have a picture. The type of information you need to compute the potential gains or losses from the BRI is it's a fine description. You need for any pair of countries in the world and any sector in the world, what would be the decrease in trade costs that you could expect once all transport projects have been implemented. And that's what we do. We actually put a database freely available online. So anyone who wishes to work on the Belt and Road Initiative, there's this database online that gives you country to country, but also city to city, that gives you the expected potential gains in terms of trade costs of implementing all the BRI projects. So, and we hope that people are going to use this database to enrich our understanding of the BRI. Right. So once you do that, what would be the gains in terms of reducing shipment time and decreasing the trade costs from the BRI? So let me just look at that, and then the map. I'm not sure it's actually legible. So we have two scenarios, a lower bound and an upper bound. Roughly, all around the world, trade costs are going to decrease by 1% or between 1 and 2.2%. You might say, that's not super big. That's actually huge, because a lot of country pairs are going to gain zero. So trade costs between US and Canada, that's going to be, the gain from the BRI is going to be exactly zero. Or the US and Mexico, So that's, take a weighted average of all the country pairs in the world, you still have somewhat significant gains in terms of the reduction in trade costs. And so you could also aggregate those reduction in trade costs by region pair. So of course, again, what are the gains within Latin America, from Latin America to Latin America? Zero, right? Or between North America and Latin America, zero. So there's no gain in those trade costs. But some of those cells in this matrix are pretty big. On average, across all countries, the decrease in trade costs in South Asia and East Asia Pacific, it's already almost 4%. So 4% reduction in trade costs, when you're familiar with the trade literature, it's actually very somewhat significant. And you see, that's a non-symmetric matrix. So what does it mean? It means that sometimes the decrease in trade costs between country A and country B is not the same as between country B and country A, because that depends on the sectoral composition of what you trade. Again, some sectors are time sensitive, and some sectors are not time sensitive. So the measure we have is a directional measure. Maybe the decrease in trade costs from China to, let's say, France is going to be big, but from France to China, not that big. Again, that depends on the sectoral composition. So in a nutshell, that's what you have. And what I want to emphasize already is the following kind of easy to understand idea. Those projects, which I show you very briefly on the map, they're going to be mostly focused in Asia. Not only a bit in Europe, but mostly focused in Asia, right? But now, if you implement those projects, who is going to gain? The answer is everyone. Everyone. Because those new ports are going to be used by American ships as well. Or, those new pieces of rail that connect the sea in Pakistan to China, those rails are going to be used by French companies shipping to China. So in a way, many countries that are not in the region, because of the network nature of transport infrastructure, will gain from the BRI. And that will be very important to remember when we look at who gains and who loses from the general equilibrium. And we can see that all around. Most of the gains, of course, are going to be within the BRI region. But when you look at North America, it also decreases its cost of trading with East Asia, even with Europe or South Asia. So everybody will gain from the BRI, not all country pairs in the world, but each country in the world with at least some of their trade partners are going to gain, both in terms of decreasing the cost of sourcing your inputs or sourcing your consumption if you're consuming goods from abroad, and in terms of reducing the cost of accessing foreign markets when you produce and you export. And you have those. those two forces. So now that we have this database, again, freely available, please use it, that allows you to know how much trade costs are going to decrease. Let's feed that into a somewhat standard model of trade. So it's going to be something from Caliendo and Paro. So I'm not going to show you equations, but the idea is to say, look, it's a world where countries trade because they have competitive advantage. So there's a reason for why country trades. Because they have different trade costs across countries, which feeds into the competitive advantage, actually, and because consumers might have different tastes. So the weight you attribute to a given sector in terms of consumption bundle depends on depends on the country. And so it's a model that is actually fairly simple once you solve it the right way, because it allows you to make sense of a lot of complex stuff in the world, in particular complex input-output linkages all across countries in a rather simple way. Just before I dig into a bit more into the mechanism and the results, one thing. So this was a well-established and recognized model of trade that we didn't invent. But the thing is, usually it has been used in research papers to assess changes in policy. So changes that have no cost, like you decrease tariff. So what would be the new change? In our case, a very important thing when we think about the BRI is the costs of implementing those new ports, new rails, upgraded port, upgraded rail. And it would be a bit stupid to do an analysis in terms of welfare and GDP gains for the BRI if we didn't take into account the exact cost per country. So that's actually another part of the project that took us actually a lot of time because is to say, look, what is country by country the amount of money countries need to invest so that they could have access, they could materialize the decreasing trade costs we talked about. And that's hard because when you look at the figures you can find in the press, in releases by governments and the Chinese Communist Party, you always have grand figures and you're not sure exactly what's in those figures. Transport or not transport project, what was the exact scale of the thing that. So we're a bit lost in terms of what to do. So we in order to be consistent with the list of projects we take into account in the transport network analysis, I put that in the beginning, what we had to do is come up with our own estimates from the bottom up. So we have the list of projects, country by country, and we have at the World Bank colleagues in each of those countries. So the idea was to leverage the knowledge of the World Bank to say, look, I know you're talking about Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. We have colleagues that are specifically working on those countries. So let's send them the list of projects that we are considering in this analysis and ask them if they have private information or about the cost of this exact project, or if they don't, if they could tell us what is the average cost of building 1 kilometer of rails or of upgrading 1 kilometer of rails in their country. So that whatever happens, we ask them to give us some way to compute the cost of building the project we want to consider. And in the end, we have roughly 370 billion. That's the cost of implementing only those projects we take into account. Again, that's not the whole BRI. The BRI also has projects related to dams, to power plants, to coal, to ICTs. All those stuff those extra stuff are incorporated in the cost of the BRI you see in the press. But that's something we have nothing to say about. We wanted to focus on the transport infrastructure that are advanced enough in terms of planning that we could put on a map, right? Okay, so you have this model. You use data to calibrate all the input-output linkages, and hence backing out from the data the revealed comparative advantage. That's key for the model. You can calibrate it for many countries. So we have 107 countries and more than 30 sectors. And we simulate the gain from the BRI. So we inject into the model the decrease in trade costs, and we ask the big machinery to what would be the gain. So the gain, first in terms of GDP. So BRI core, it's a bit small, but BRI core, that's what we call countries that signed the BRI MOU, so Memorandum of Understanding, and also actually have projects we could map. Because there's a lot of countries that actually signed the stuff, but we didn't see any transport projects, or it was like at the planning stage that was so not advanced that it was impossible to put on the map. So BRI Accords are those countries that will indeed have projects within their boundaries. So those guys, in terms of GDP, they're going to gain. We expect them to gain 3.4%. That's huge, just from implementing the transport project we have. BRI area, so all countries who signed the memorandum of understanding, but including countries that do not have transport projects, still very high, 3.35%. But the funny thing is this: look, so non-BRI area, so all those countries, like the US, like France, like Brazil, those countries, on average, those non-BRI countries, they are not going to pay a dime in the model and in reality. And they're going to benefit from it. So 2.61%, the increase in GDP, those non-BRI countries could expect if we implement all projects that we are able to put on the map. And then there's, within those aggregates, there's a lot of heterogeneity. Look, Laos is going to gain 13% in terms of GDP. That's huge. That's GDP, right? That's not welfare. So now, what's the difference in the context of an economic model between GDP and welfare? So GDP, that's the gains in terms of production, value added produced in the country, but not all of the value added produced in the country can be consumed by the consumer. Why is the case? Because we have trade imbalances sometimes, but mostly, which is there in the model, but mostly because some of the countries need to pay to get those infrastructure in place, right? Now, the kind of more interesting thing is to look at the actual gains in terms of increased real consumption in those countries. So factoring in the fact that countries might have gains in terms of GDP, but they have to pay so much to get those gains that in net, they might not gain so much. And here you see, you have some countries, so that in the upper bound scenario, in the lower bound scenario, it's even worse. Lower bounds, there's even less for the same amount of money, even less decrease in trade costs. So of course, there are going to be more countries that are hurt by the BRI. But even in the upper bound, which we think is pretty optimistic already, there are some countries, so Mongolia and Azerbaijan are one of those. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan I put it there because it's a group of countries that also loses with the lower bound scenario. Those countries, they have big GDP gains, or somewhat sizable GDP gains, but the cost of investing into those new transport projects is so big that in the end, we expect them to lose in terms of real consumption. And to us, that's kind of the second message. So the first message was about the systemic impacts. And so it's going to have a large impact on all the world, and that's pretty hard to forecast, so we need proper tools. And the second message, once you understand it has a complicated and large impact, some countries gain a lot, some countries actually tend to lose, and some of the countries lose kind of a lot. So here we can start to feel there will be a misalignment between the cost and the benefits of the Belt and Road Initiative. And when you think about it, that's something that Kerem actually just told me on the way in when we were working. That's something that will happen anytime you invest into a network, right? The logic of investing into a network here, a network of transportation infrastructure, you enrich the network, it will benefit those around the area where you invested, but it might benefit much more the rest of the network. So let's try and analyze those gains. What if I regress the GDP gains on the change of the reduction in export costs, right? So do you gain because you have a better access to foreign market as an exporter, right? So that explains only 27% of the gain, depending on the country. What if you regress the GDP gains on the weighted average of imports for a country? That also explains 38% of the 39% around this right way of the gains. Now, that was for the GDP, right? For the welfare, so welfare is the gains in terms of production efficiency, in a way, minus the cost of paying for the thing. Now, once you factor in the cost of the BRI, change in export or import costs explain even less the net welfare gains. And because I'm a bit late, let me show you just that. If you regress, you try and assess the correlation between all countries, between the GDP gains and the investment in the first place. You have something that is upward sloping, so that on average, it's right, the more you invest in terms of transport infrastructure, the more you will gain. But the R square, so the ability of this variable to fit data is pretty low, it's like 33%. Now, in terms of welfare, is it the case, in terms of real consumption, that those that invest more gain more on average? Here, the point estimate is just 0. So it is not true, given all the analysis that we've been doing, it is not true that those who invest a lot into the BRI gain more in terms of the BRI. And some countries actually gain in terms of welfare, so we expect them to lose from the BRI. So now it points us to two things. There's two more messages I wanted to put forward. So this one I'm going to go quick, and the second maybe a couple of minutes. So should we be surprised by the size of the gains we could expect from the BRI? So our view is that, so those are very big gains at the world level, big gain in terms of GDP. So in terms of GDP level, not growth rate. So like if you implement all those projects, the level of GDP would increase by that much. But then you also have a trend in GDP growth that we don't model. But this is a big gain. Is it surprising? We think it's not, because it's a very big shock to BRI. There's a lot of money put into it. It's going to reshape completely the transport infrastructure, and it's going to redistribute comparative advantage across countries. So it's not that surprising. And that's something that has been discussed actually in the previous session. Some of those projects might happen regardless of the BRI. So in a sense, a lot of projects that are labeled BRI now, and they say in press releases, this is part of the BRI, are not really BRI because they were launched before 2013, the launch of the BRI, or just because anyway they would have done this highway, this port, because it's fancy to be labeled BRI because you could attract the money more easily, you just label BRI. So I'm not sure this is how much Xi Jinping is going to give to the world. So no, a lot of those projects will have happened regardless of the BRI and this initiative. But once you put together, this is the gains. And another thing I want to emphasize is that now it's a bit technical because I want to compare the gains from the rest of the trade literature. When you compare those gains with the rest of the trade literature, they are very big. Like, as if the gains from this initiative is much bigger than the NAFTA or the projected gain from TPP. Like, it's super big. Why is it the case? The BRI is also going to decrease the cost of sourcing input from your own country. Right. Remember, the way we compute the gains in terms of trade costs, that we have many cities. So within a given country, we have many cities. So we could compute gains in terms of reducing trade costs within countries as well. And because the sourcing of inputs is mostly at home and a bit abroad at home, those within country gains also play a significant role in explaining the big gains you have from the BRI. So it's not only an international endeavor. So it's also a within-country reorganization of production that will allow countries to actually be more integrated within their boundaries and hence gain efficiency. And the last thing I want to say is this. So we were kind of shocked when we looked at the result because we realized that so the benefits of those transport projects are going to be felt by everyone. But who is going to pay for those projects? Only a narrow set of countries. So we thought, okay, if you do some kind of return analysis and you ask the question, are those projects, do those projects have a positive internal rate of return? Does it make sense economically to do those projects? If you do an only narrowly defined analysis, you might find that no, they are not viable. Indeed, so some of the countries we have, we lose. So for those countries, you can't expect the increase in economic activity to actually pay back from those things. This is right. But for the world as a whole, there's still a net large positive gain, which means you could actually reshuffle the cost of investing into the BRI into such a way that everyone would gain the same. And if you do that, everyone will gain quite a lot, more than 2% in terms of welfare. So here, I'm not going to discuss the exact things, but we do exactly that. This counterfactual experiment, when we ask the following question, how would you allocate the payments so that all BRI countries would gain the same? And this exercise shows us that if you wanted all BRI countries to have the net gain being equalized, right? A lot of transfers. And some countries not only will not pay anything, will just receive money from other countries to be compensated for the fact that they're going to gain too little compared to other countries that would otherwise have net gains that would be super high. So again, I don't expect policymakers to actually believe those numbers so hard that they're going to ask countries and China to pay much more. I mean, but we want to put on the table the following idea. The BRI is so big and so complex in terms of reorganization in the transport and the comparative advantage that we need to have instruments, so maybe the AIIB, or like coordination device, so that we can share the cost in a better way to take into account the fact that because those projects are complex, some countries will just be transit countries, they will pay a lot, not benefit that much. What we need is a way to reallocate the cost that is a bit more tilted towards a fair allocation, in the sense that if you benefit a lot, even though you might have no transport within your border, you still need to pitch in. You still need to decrease the burden on poor countries that are so far expected to pay a lot and not benefit that much. And to conclude, so let me just focus on the second bullet point, which is kind of a standard disclaimer, especially at the World Bank. What we assume in this analysis is a world where workers could move very easily from sector to sector. And so this complex reallocation of comparative advantage is, in a way, kind of efficient, right? And there's no loss of human capital. It's not because you were a worker in a given industry that if you move, you're going to lose your human capital. We don't model that. In reality, we know there are frictions in terms of reallocating workers, capital, loss of human capital. So I think that all those numbers, which are big, so the world could, as a whole, could gain a lot in terms of the BRI. Not all countries, some will lose, but the world could gain a lot only if also policymakers take into account the fact that they need to help workers reallocate across sectors. And I'm going to stop there.
Excellent, thank you. So I propose we take 3 questions to first speaker, and then we continue over coffee. In fact, I have the first question.
Yeah, sure.
For you. So obviously the other end of the land bridge is Europe, and you're saying, well, maybe Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan being in the transit, they're going to build all these roads for the transit to Europe. So does the transfers include Europe pitching in, or?
No. The transfers is only within what we call BRI countries. So you have to sign the memorandum. It's only within BRI core countries. So here, actually we did both, but what I showed here is an exercise when you say, this is the list of countries that so far will pay. They pay to different extent, but they pay. I keep the group of countries the same. I just reshuffle payments so that those guys that will invest could actually gain the same in nets.
So I understand that you have to make a decision on
the group, exactly.
Right, but if you don't, then I don't know, the matrix at Europe somewhere, is Europe a relatively large gain that is not paying?
So Europe, it's hard to see. But at least in terms of gains, when you look at Europe, Europe and East Asia Pacific, it's among the highest gain because of the new ports, because of after the port, the piece of rail that allows you to reach inland countries. So you will gain, even though you don't invest a dime, you will gain in terms of market access to East Asia mostly, South Asia as well. Again, those numbers depends on the sectoral composition of what you trade. So sometimes some of the numbers are weird, but that's just a reflection of do you trade time sensitive or non time sensitive goods. But so in a nutshell, yes, Europe gains quite a lot, and they're not paying anything. And this suggests that they should pitch in to help countries like like Mongolia, like Azerbaijan, because otherwise those countries are going to suffer from the BRI.
My name is John Brandon, I'm with the Asian Foundation. I was thinking about, you talk about the general premise of how trade will grow, there'll be benefit, economic benefit for all these countries as a result of these BRI projects. I was thinking of the projects that would involve rails, particularly in Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And the width of rails are not all the same. And so it makes me think that you know, despite the efforts at connectivity, that there's an impediment by rail being different, the width of rail being different in Cambodia or Laos as opposed to, let's say, Thailand. That would slow up trade. And so I was wondering if you had factored any of that into your analysis, or if you have, how much more would trade be facilitated as a result of
harmonization
having the
of the
same
gauge.
type of uniform construction?
So I can answer the first question, but not the second. So how much we would gain from harmonizing the gauge? We didn't do the analysis, so I can't tell you. Did we take that into account? We did, in the sense that if two rails are connected in reality, they have the same gauge. And that's why we see in the current and the expected network of transportation, some stuff being non-connected, meaning there's no train that goes through. So we take that into account because in our model, they are not connected, so there's no way to go from one piece to another. One of the things, I mean, now it's a well-known thing that is part of the BRI is the dry port of Korgos, right? So you have, coming from the Chinese side, some rails, some width in between the two rails, and then on the Kazakhstan side, you have other rails with other width. So they have these dry ports that just take containers from one train to the next. And so that typically is one of the important drivers of the gains we have, because in the pre-BRI world, there's no connection between those two rail systems. Because of these Korgos dry ports, what we have is a point of contact between previously two separated systems that allow trains. You have to go to this particular dry port, but to go from the Chinese width to the Kazakhstan and then to European width. So we take into account the world as it is and the gains that are expected from those ports and so devices that allow different rail systems to talk to connect.
Brandon Womack, Politics Department. I found your analysis of transport effects of BRI very interesting. I'm wondering how they would fit into an even larger framework of BRI effects. As I've read recently, 30% of cost of BRI projects is transportation, 40% is energy. I'm sure the energy could be further subdivided into energy extraction, petroleum, whatever, and local electrification. And local electrification in Pakistan or wherever would be very, very, very important for industrialization of whatever in that country. How have you considered this larger framework of the other BRI investments?
So short answer, no. So
this is complicated enough.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, but what's pretty interesting in your question is the fact that we actually have discussed that, and I'm not sure if you did it, Mathilde, because at some point we started thinking about that, and so maybe you went through after I left the bank. But exactly, we thought that the energy aspect was actually a key aspect of the BRI, and we were a bit sad that we didn't say anything about that in this paper. And in particular, one of the things we wanted to think about is the fact that depending on the country, the energy dependence or how much of GDP boost you would get from having a better and more reliable supply of energy would differ vastly. And hence the gains of the BRI and the heterogeneity of those gains are hard to predict. You need to study that very precisely. So we recognize we didn't do it, and I hope my colleague, I left the World Bank, but I hope my colleagues who are still at the World Bank actually started the work on that. But.
We are working on
I have a project for, I have a question for Maggie. So you emphasize that Chinese outward direct investment in non-construction follows construction with some lag, but there's some correlation there. So that's based on historical data, most of which is not into BRI count. So you try to control for business environment and so on, but it's a very different type of countries in terms of security, governance, and so on. And plus, the government doesn't have as much leverage on private Chinese entrepreneurs, multinational firms, to go abroad and say set up shop in manufacturing. What's your sense of the possibility, how realistic it is that, say, Pakistan will now become a production hub for Chinese producers in textiles and others?
I think in the short run, that's going to be very challenging. I think the driver of Chinese FDI is still the SOEs, not really so much from private sector, private companies. So I don't see a lot of that kind of activity happening in the short run. But in the long run, I think it's possible some activities might be shifted, with the rising middle class and so on. There's a lot of research showing that, Chinese multinational companies have some comparative advantage in navigating in countries with lower quality institutional environment, partly because of the experiences, of working in similar environments in other countries. So I do see that as a possibility, but I don't see that happening further.
Maybe one last question.
Can I ask general questions?
Please.
I've been learning from different presenters, about how do we see BRI and compare BRI with the American strategy and explain and also criticizing. But I really like the I think it's our first speaker, so he's kind of asking a question of what is actually BRI if it's not President Xi's strong will, if it's not economic, what is that? But I like to push this question at an ontological level about what is, to help me understand what are we criticizing, what are we comparing. And the reason I ask this question is, let's take this kind of community of common destiny as one example. And so I found this kind of concept extremely interesting, and I am an international standard researcher, so I've been seeing how Chinese keep saying, making China standard, and they have a very, very different way of imagining the world, how world function, and imagining globalization. So my question, and they have been saying like dialectic unity instead of, right? So how do we understand this type of language? I think it's so important for us to kind of ask, is China just going to become the next supernature power to following the U.S., following the Western country, and replace it these countries, or actually they have a very different way of thinking about the world. History shows us that the nation state is a Western concept, and it seems China is kind of producing not just following this Western path. While they are doing this, they also are creating their own discourse language. So my question is, at an ontological level, how do we really kind of dive into this key concept and truly understand what Chinese is producing?
We finish with Russian.
Harry,
you want to take a bet?
No.
Okay, sure. It's a great question. I am not sure I have a good answer to that question. The question of what BRI is, it's hard to answer because it's almost like almost all of external political economy. It's almost like the political economy of China is being externalized in many ways. So that's why I think it makes sense not to look at BRI as a whole, but to look at individual BRI projects. For economic research, it's different. But for assessing intentions or goals or objectives, I think it's best to look at the projects individually. But you raise an interesting point, which is that even if we take this individual approach, there's still overall set of interests that China has, how the globe should be, how power should be organized, or how order should be created. And I don't know that they have an answer yet on exactly what that will look like.
sources indicate that there is clear certainty that it is time for change. It's a unique moment of opportunity. But this change in the international system is not seen in 100 years. What comes next? The Chinese approach, I think they're actively researching. And that's why I mentioned, this is not I mentioned, but the number one focus for research in universities in international relations in China has shifted from maritime affairs, like territorial disputes, to global governance, what they call global governance. But they don't mean by global governance what the US, they don't mean climate change, they don't mean solving economic, transnational, financial challenges or disease management. They mean global governance as in the way you talked about it. How will the system be organized as a whole? What will sovereignty look like? What will power look like? What will intervention look like? What will everything look like? But it's early, and this is such a complicated question, and I don't think they have an answer yet. So hopefully that helps push things a little bit. But I think we'll see in the next 10 years, China proactively shape global norms and institutions the way it did in the last 10 years, shape regional ones.
I think it's an excellent question, and we know, is this on? No. We know that the Chinese are fascinated by the concept of discourse power. And basically, it's exactly what you're referring to, is defining or redefining concepts, norms, basically the language by which we analyze and try to shape international relationships. I think I agree with Rush that they are in the process of trying to do this. And I would expect that as they move along, it's going to be a combination of entirely new concepts, a reiteration or restatement of old concepts, and something in the middle. For example, at one extreme, is there really a difference between the idea of a community of human community of common destiny and what Westerners have long called the international community? I don't think there is. It's basically that the United States, under the Trump administration, has, with the especially when General McMaster was the national security advisor, explicitly rejected the concept of an international community, saying there is no such thing because there is not a sufficient kind of range of common interests and values and support for institutions. So in a way, the Chinese are again picking up the gap that we've created. I don't see any big, it's different words, but same concept. The other extreme, I know that for many years, you mentioned the nation state. Yes, it's a Western concept. Also, it's a very flawed concept. There's a very, very small number of nation states. That is, states that comprise one nation. That was a Wilsonian concept. That was the way you were going to solve some of the problems that led to World War I. So, to be blunt, lazy political scientists still use the concept nation state to mean state. And as I say, most states are multinational states, including China. But no matter how we look at it, yes, Western political science and IR theory has focused largely on the state. The Chinese have, as I understand it, tried to develop a set of concepts that focus on the relationship between states as the major building block rather than the state in isolation. There's some new work out on this that I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I think that they will try to develop some new concepts. And once again, they'll be filling in real gaps. It's not that they will, out of selfish interest, be overthrowing everything, but they'll basically say Western concepts are flawed. And let's see, and they are. Let's see if they can come up with something better. I hope they can.
Thank you. Elena or Daniel, you want to continue?
Well, actually, I just want to thank all our speakers, presenters, organizers, and everyone for spending Friday afternoon instead of partying. Okay, so now I hope we still have some refreshment outside, and let's continue the discussion. And I hope this is the beginning of a series of study and conversations on the BRI. Thank you.